Thank you, Dennis. I want to speak to you today about the Constitution of the United States, the nature of the Constitution, and its relation to all of you. I want to tell you first that we need not despair that we find ourselves supposedly with little power and that all is lost because society and the government today is corrupted. We have potential and principle all around, and we rest on a firm historical foundation, but that potential is something that we must find the means to put back into expression. And I'd like to reference also what Bruce Fein said about the responsibility of your fellow man, that what we have is a people which is afraid of the government, rightfully so, afraid of the banks. They don't like the banks and other things. And we have a problem where we can't seem to elect leaders who will follow through with the appropriate principles, but it is also a reflection of the fact that we don't have a citizenry that will support those principles and such elected representatives of the people. So this is a paradox. What we have is we require a new government, however, not to be feared by the people, but one that will bring the Constitution back alive, for it is a living document. It is not a set of rules, which I hope to demonstrate to you now. That, in fact, what we've had in the history of the United States is a constant process of expression through new experiments of government, through new experiments of using the powers of the Constitution in ways that had never been done before, but were the appropriate means in that time period and moved the nation forward, not according to the desires and prejudices of the people, but in direct contradiction to their desires, but to their immediate benefit and what was needed. So the issue is now, what is the proper methods today? But this is something which has been the case since the founding of the United States. As John Quincy Adams illustrates in his 50th anniversary to the Constitution address to the New York Historical Society, 1839, it was in fact that which founded the Constitution, the implied powers of the Declaration of Independence, which said that we have the right to do all that which free and independent states may have right do, and became the guardians of the people according to the rights of the people, that it was a government bestowed by the people upon those who sought to represent now, as they said, united colonies, because from the authority of the people. And so we had a situation where 8 days after the Declaration of Independence, which said that instituted by themselves, the Declaration was a charter based on the rights of man. They appealed to the natural rights of man, natural law. And upon this, and appealing to the laws of the universe, they said that in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, we declare these to be united colonies and independent states, by the authority of the people. John Quincy Adams points out at 8 days after July 4th, 1776, on July 12th, one of the members of that Congress who voted against the Declaration of Independence quickly organized groups that would plan for now how to make sure we protect and reserve the rights of the colonies. Colonies which had now become united and had actually become states. That they were now independent states based on becoming united from the authority of the people, but they quickly turned it around and within the course of a year deliberated and reversed what was a sovereign power from the people. Now they assumed and usurped that power as sovereign states. That now these were sovereign states that were, it was something directly in contradiction. The Declaration of Independence was from the right of the people, and the sovereign states were from power. This is the story of Alexander Hamilton, and I'd like to discuss this with you. For what we have to do now is that Alexander Hamilton was in the middle of this precise situation, and he saw what he described as the want of power of Congress. The want of power to get from the states of the Union the support of for the military, the support of other things, but it was not something which they could have the state legislatures bestow upon this Congress. See, this was the situation. Now the states were supposed to bestow upon the Congress something which the states were not authorized to bestow because they had assumed the power from the people. But Hamilton was facing this, and he said, we have needed powers, trade, taxation, that there are those who are being swept up into these trade wars and their own interests, and as he said, are therefore sacrificing the future to the president. People get caught into factions. And his measure, his agenda was to use those powers that were implied in the Declaration of Independence. As he said, the spirit of 76, the men of 76 had lost that spirit and now were prostrated and begging to the states for things which they had no right. They had not gone to the states and gotten a convention of the people to have them bestow upon themselves as a new government. That the Declaration of Independence, they assumed a sovereign authority based on the rights of the people, but the one thing they forgot to do, as John Quincy Adams states in his speech, is they forgot to found a government based on the authority of the people. Instead, they founded governments based on a usurped power of state sovereignty. Alexander Hamilton said we must use these powers to benefit the people, and he's told his comrade-at-arms, John Laurens, he said, as the war was coming to an end, he said, "Peace made, my dear friend, a new scene opens. The object then will be to make our independence a blessing. To do this, we must secure our union on solid foundations. A Herculean task, effect which mountains of prejudice must be leveled." So it was putting something now of what was required to be done that was against the prejudices of the people, which is always the case. It must be undertaken in such a manner. Hamilton saw beyond this bankruptcy of the states, the trade wars, to what was actually lacking, the cause of these crises in the immediate situation. And in his organizing of the Continentalist Papers and the Federalist Papers, it is the key question of the powers which he takes up, that there was a jealousy of power, rightfully so, of executive power, and they thought they could have a government of these states. And so there were many good men who was caught up in that view of things. But Hamilton Socratically demonstrated to the people through the Federalist Papers that every power ought to be in proportion to its object, that the means ought to be proportioned to the end, that every power ought to be commensurate with its object, that there ought to be no limitation of a power destined to effect a purpose which is itself incapable of limitation. That the powers of the needed powers that a Congress had to have were not rules that the people, some of the people were so feared would become imposed, the indefinite taxation clause, which was so feared. These were principles which needed to be of the latitude that was commensurate with the object. The object was the independence of the United States, the freedom of and happiness of the people, and the freedom from the British Empire. And in elaborating this, he describes where the prejudice lay in the inability to conceive the nation as one single idea, the inability of those who didn't share his motivation and others to achieve something which, again, is the expression of an implied power, which is all around us at all times, waiting to be implemented, but which requires a needed group of people and a needed understanding to make it conceivable to the people how to implement this. And he describes how these powers work. He says, because there were many who said, we can't have the power of taxation. We can't have the power of regulation of trade. It will become abusive. And he said, what is a power? But the ability or faculty of doing a thing. What is the ability to do a thing, but the power of employing the means necessary to its execution? You say, I have the power to walk across the room, but how am I going to get across the room? There has to be a means of getting there. What is a legislative power, but the power of making laws? What are the means to execute a legislative power but laws? What is the power of laying and collecting taxes but a legislative power, or a power of making laws to lay and collect taxes? What are the proper means of executing such a power but necessary and proper laws? So there was a cry that if the government can make all laws necessary, then it could usurp the powers of the states. But the power had to be commensurate with the object. And therefore, the means are not described. The Constitution is a statement of the nature of government and a nature of powers. It is not a list of means. The Constitution defines the what must be done, which powers a government should have, but it does not define the how, which is the current liberal view that you have amongst many people in the United States, that there are two views of the Constitution. One is implied powers and one is literal. This is not something that can be wishy-washy discussed. There's one view that is correct, and that is how Hamilton founded the Constitution, which is this issue of a power being a principle and not a rule. This is the experimental nature of government. This is what makes the government today inept and perhaps to themselves quite boring, is that they're not conducting the creative aspect of government to create the necessary means to legislate that which is appropriate to a situation, not a tradition, a precedent of certain the ways in which certain powers are expressed. This is the creative effort of legislation. And what Hamilton stated in the Federalist Papers is that nothing could be more fallacious than to limit a power to current necessities, the current state of the United States. The issue is to find which powers are required to draw forth the potential. Hamilton won with his fellow collaborators an instrument to conduct such an experiment. This was, of course, the United States Constitution. So Hamilton conducted his first experiment, having developed through this whole period a sense of the relation of how to draw forth the resources of the country, which was the restoration of the public credit through assuming the national debt. And he turned what was money now into something that represented the powers of Congress, that represented the potential of the nation. That what was circulating throughout the colonies now, which was formerly worthless paper certificates from the war, was now, by assuming the national debt and putting the full powers of Congress behind it, in regulating trade and issuing the duty law, the first act of Congress in 1789, July 4th, after they cleared the room where they said, this is how we have to take oaths and appeal to God for our right to be a legislator. The first real act was then the application of the duty on July 4th, 1789. This tied now the value of the public debt, which was a liberty debt. It wasn't worthless. It wasn't a question of money. It was tied to now the first idea of a debt that was expression of the unification of the power of the United States because of what Hamilton and his collaborators did. And now this national debt became a value which circulated and tied the holders of it to the prosperity of the Union. And it paid out an interest from the government, which was not therefore just money that could be thrown away, as gold and silver can wash through a country and never take hold, because the difference between credit and money is that credit ties you to the future. And those who go into debt for productive purposes versus those who have hereditary wealth often do much different things with what is seemingly the same money. So this was now wealth based on credit. It was now value was determined by a sovereign nation. And he embodied these powers. And it was this by which the system could be founded. We now had a currency which was internally defined, not externally defined. We had a currency which could now be something which applied principles of manufacturing and agriculture and technologies could express themselves and be able to be applied and strengthen the medium of the currency. This led to the second part of this experiment, which was the national bank. Now the holders of these certificates that circulated across the Union, 70 million in US public debt, which were valuable and could be exchanged to make a payment system among commerce and agriculture manufacturers. Now, through the bank, we allowed this great national debt to be a capital which could be lent, which is not just a question, again, of money, but a bank that was a legislative act to create an economy. And the Bank of the United States, which was the second act done by that Congress in accordance with Hamilton's program in 1791, was now, again, a means to execute and make these powers of Congress, not one of them, not that the Bank of the United States related to taxation, or the Bank of the United States related to how we could pay our debts, or related to regulation of trade. It did all of those things, but it was a means to express this full power of the Constitution. And as he writes to George Washington, that this general principle is inherent in the very definition of government and essential to every step of progress to be made by that of the United States, namely, that every power vested in a government is in its nature sovereign and includes by force of the term a right to employ all the means requisite and fairly applicable to the attainment of the ends of such power. So the power to make this bank was again not an object of commerce. Like the public credit, they were both particular ways, and he came up as an experimentalist with the best appropriate means of this situation. And so these means, however, are a delicate means. And by the time we got to before the War of 1812, the correlation between the powers and the means became clouded. And the lawful relation between the bank and how this Congress had instituted sovereignty was lost by many people, even the great Henry Clay, who said, the foreigners own the capital. And 70% of the bank was now foreign capital, but it was being lent out for us. They had no control over the voting and so forth. But the delicate system of the American system of political economy that John Quincy Adams expressed in the form, not the term of the word, but in the substance of the laws, the protectionism, the Bank of the United States, and internal improvements. This was a system which was, again, as seen through the bank, this was a means which had to be understood by the people as the way in which these powers of Congress that had won the Constitution actually functioned. So as soon as you lose the connection between the means, they become something that can be twisted with popular opinion. And this is, of course, the nature of Republican government, that, as John Quincy Adams lays out in his speech, the virtue of the people is, the Republican government is based on virtue, but virtue in the principles of whatever document it is that founds that government. Our government was founded on the principles of self-evident rights of man and the principles in the Constitution to form a more perfect union and establish the things that it lays out in the Constitution. This is the virtue. If these are lost, then the nation will fail. But that is the only form of government that can function because it has to be based on the deliberation of man and of reason. So each of these measures of Hamilton, which I could go through more at length, but for lack of time, we'll just state it as these means here. The public credit, the national bank, the national debt, creating seemingly the mechanical features of banking of Venice and other things, but it was not that. It was for how to define a sovereign nation, and throughout it was an expression of the government. So we've allowed our economy to go follow. We're being destroyed by large international cartels that globalization is now the rule. We have a threat of hyperinflation globally, devaluation of all the currencies and all the means of any payment. But how come? And I would contend that we do not face any larger enemies that Hamilton faced. He faced all of the popular masses in Western Pennsylvania. Who were they run by? They were run by the same empire. He faced the prejudice against manufacturers, people in the South, the slaveholders that Andrew Jackson appeased and destroyed the government into a simple machine, as he called it. Who are they run by? And we face international seeming enemies and others who want to stop progress, but it's not the issue. The issue is, can we find among the citizens of the United States a consciousness of how to wield these powers of the government? Because we rest on the firm foundation of the Declaration and the Constitution. And we have all sovereign right to use these powers, as we could wipe out all of these speculators by appealing to the means that we need to employ in Article 1, Section 8. How are these large speculative institutions borrowing money, seemingly on the credit of the United States, since it's backed by the FDIC? They don't have the authority to do such a thing. How can we employ the powers of our government if our currency has been turned into absolute garbage due to an enormous derivatives machine that has devalued everything? How can we deal with this? We have to ask, are the laws that we would enact to bring down this system in correspondence with our constitutional powers? Not are they a violation of the right of property, because the right of property is not a right. You don't have a right to destroy the United States. I would say now, what are the proper means for us to employ? Glass-Steagall is a mean of the power of Congress. This is to reclaim our right over all of these of payment of debt, taxation, regulation of the currency that is in Article 1, Section 8. All of these powers have been always the target and cause of the destruction of the nation. Every single time we achieved a use of these, they were attacked as separate means, and we would lose the regulation of the currency and the use of the same mechanics for a much higher purpose. People say now you don't have the power to interfere in the market, right? We will, with NWAPA 21, we will bring together the raw material producers of the country as we can and say, what can you produce? What can you produce and how fast? And we're not going to pay you the market value determined by speculators for your raw materials, your steel, your iron, and so on. We'll pay you the cost of production and a small profit. The banks can become, again, a bank system which is greatly in need of bankruptcy reorganization, right? If a bank system that we legislate with our own state charters cannot create a dollar which is stable and a fixed exchange rate and a dollar which is valuable, and cannot allow us to collect the necessary taxes for the benefit of the people, and interfere with our ability to pay debts. This is perhaps an unconstitutional banking system, but definitely something that is required to take into bankruptcy reorganization. That is Glass-Steagall. They will be allowed to make a profit. They will be allowed to make a profit that partakes in the valid increase of physical value with the manufacturing of raw materials and the construction of a nationwide system of infrastructure and internal improvements. That's the only valid profit that banks should be allowed to partake in. And they will want to become, again, a facilitator of the people. That would be a means. NWAPA 21 is something new. It's something which, like under Hamilton's time and under John Quincy Adams' time, you have lives as a great experiment, that they individually discovered the new means for their time. And we have to do the same now. That the measures we seek with the 3-point program with LaRouchePAC.com, these are the means to express the power of the nation and that the nation itself is the expression of what is really the highest form of political organization that we have. But if we don't use the implied powers that are all around us, just as these other men I described discovered how to use, then they become rules and they become tradition. The issue is not to create a citizenry that can observe all of that is bad. And as I say again, we have a lot of the same enemies, but I would say they're no more greater than the enemies Hamilton faced. The issue is, can we observe what is bad, but use the firm powers that we rest upon in the Constitution? So when we enact this great policy, we have to ask, essentially, what is required as this great experiment, as in the historical cases of Hamilton and Biddle, to bring the principle of power into existence. And the principle isn't really the power of mankind to govern himself and to approve what we find now as the sorry lot of the nation. But it's only sorry through lack of use. And our children may find themselves in a similarly sorry lot, and they'll grow up and say, what is this sorry lot I've inherited? And they themselves also have to discover the correct means for their situation. And the expression of the credit system as the third means will have its own unique form, which will have to be demonstrated by us. So thank you.